Okay, a few more people just kind of joining from the waiting room, but I think I'll kick us off. So a really warm welcome. We're really pleased that you could join us today. Today we're excited to be running through an introduction to the Carbon Accelerator Programme for the Environment, or CAPE for short, which was launched a couple of weeks ago at COP16, CBD COP16, which was a great launch event. The CAPE is led by FSD Africa in partnership with Finance Earth and the African Natural Capital Alliance, or ANCA. And we've got various team members from those three organisations with us today, and you'll be hearing from different members later on. We're going to structure the webinar as a presentation for the first half, and then there'll be lots of time for questions and answers in the second half. So in a moment, I'll introduce Juliette Monroe from FSD Africa to give a bit of the background and all the work that's gone into designing and getting us to this point where CAPE has been launched. I'll then introduce you to Jamie Mansfield from Finance Earth, who'll introduce the CAPE and the partnership, and before passing over to Fraser O'Halloran from Finance Earth, who'll run through the CAPE, what it is, the types of services that will be provided through CAPE, the expression of interest, which is open at the moment, and eligibility criteria and the timeline for application into the CAPE. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Juliette Monroe from FSD Africa. Welcome, Juliette.
Great, thanks a lot, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. It's really great to have you all. So I'm Juliette, I'm the Director of Early Stage Finance at FSD Africa. And just my chance to say a welcome, really, as Sarah said, an opportunity to introduce ourselves to you, to explain what CAPE is about, and give you an opportunity to ask questions. Really, our key objective here is building awareness of CAPE and encouraging projects that strongly align with the goals and the eligibility criteria that we've defined to apply to the expression of interest that Sarah mentioned. It's also to help establish connections with other organisations, I think, that have got similar goals to us, who might see an opportunity to partner with us on CAPE in some way. So do reach out if you think that applies to you. Just from an FSD Africa perspective, I'm joined by a number of colleagues on this call who are all part of the CAPE team, which include Kelvin, who's the Director of Risk and Resilience, Stephen, who's our Principal of Investments at FSD Africa Investments, and Reshma, who's Carbon Market Lead and Overall Manager for CAPE. And I think you might see one or two of them through the call, together with a whole slew of other colleagues who have been very active in designing CAPE, which include Dorothy, Jonathan, and Zomo, Hosborn, and Susan. So thanks to the team. And we're also joined by representatives from the African Natural Capital Alliance, which Sarah mentioned, which is an Africa-led multi-sector body that advocates for and drives actions around nature and nature financing, and for which FSD Africa is the Secretariat, led by Dorothy. And as Sarah mentioned, we've partnered with Finance Earth for CAPE specifically, who's helping to lead on the implementation with our support. So I will hand back to Sarah shortly to talk us through what CAPE is and what we're looking to do here. But before I do, I just wanted to emphasise really two things around CAPE: why CAPE in the first place, and where it's come from. So why CAPE? Well, really, it's very much in the crosshairs of our strategy as FSD Africa. We're all about making Africa's financial system work better so that it can deliver on environmental outcomes hand in hand with social and economic outcomes. And in order to deliver on this strategy, we've identified a number of interrelated areas of focus, which include working in strengthening carbon markets and nature financing, with a specific focus on sort of demonstrating how we can increase the quantity and quality and diversity of finance that's needed to ultimately achieve the goals that we set ourselves in our strategy. So I think with that in mind, CAPE is really there to help accelerate Africa-based high integrity nature-based carbon projects through to investment readiness, through the provision of both transaction advisory and technical project management support, which Sarah will talk about and other colleagues will talk about in more detail. But in doing that, we're really sort of trying to test three things. One of which is, what does it take to get projects that show prospects for commercial viability to a point where they can attract finance, realizing carbon revenue and moving into their growth stage, overcoming sort of various challenges that they might currently have. Secondly, what does it take to achieve positive biodiversity outcomes alongside carbon revenue, which is an area that remains largely sort of untested and obviously more complex. And then thirdly, by combining both those carbon and biodiversity dimensions together with a strong emphasis on social co-benefits, what does it take to get high integrity projects investment ready and into the market? I think what we're ultimately trying to do here is help to build a market that gets much more investment to flow, which is what's critically needed. And I think many of us in this webinar already is acutely aware of. And then the second point, where does CAPE come from? I think it hasn't come from nowhere. It really represents the culmination of various strands of work within FSD Africa, which include an extensive carbon market project development exercise that we have implemented during the course of this year and last in partnership with both the African Carbon Market Initiative and Cross Boundary. And here I'd just like to give a particular shout out to Christine and team at Cross Boundary for the excellent work that they did in helping us design that, together with Paul and team at ACME. It also comes from a lot of research and work that's been led by our nature team in partnership with the Africa Natural Capital Alliance to really sort of think about how best to finance for nature and biodiversity, and including also work underway with our investment team under FSD Africa Investments, really focusing on how we can design the right kind of investment instruments and solutions that can support these high integrity nature-based carbon projects and move them faster and more effectively towards commercial viability. So I hope that provides some of the context around who's in the room from a Finance Earth, FSD Africa and Anchor perspective, and also why CAPE. On that note, I'm going to hand back to Sarah to take us through further introductions on her side and an introduction to CAPE itself. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Juliet. It's really great to hear that this is so much work that's gone into getting it to this point, and lots of people involved in various roles doing the kind of background thinking behind it. And we're really excited that it's launched and we're kicking it off. I'm going to hand over to Jamie Mansfield now, who is co-founder and managing director at Finance Earth, one of the delivery partners for the CAPE. So Jamie, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Juliet, for giving that really, you can see a really impressive background and journey to create CAPE. So my name is Jamie Mansfield. I'm one of the co-founders and managing directors at Finance Earth, who are really acting as the impact investment advisor, helping to actually deliver the underlying program in partnership with FSD Africa. So really, what's the context? Why have we come together? And I just wanted to share some of the sort of the major drivers that we're working towards and to help try and address. So biodiversity and the climate crisis in Africa is enormous. Since 1970, over 70% of biodiversity has declined, and yet over 60% of Africa's GDP, its economic value, is linked to natural capital. There is a real intrinsic link to Africa and the value of its very precious and very unique natural capital. And yet, despite that clear pressure and clear value that it represents to the economy in Africa, there is a major funding shortfall. And clearly this is a funding shortfall that we see across the world, but particularly in Africa. So over $30 billion a year of funding, a financial gap for nature protection restoration. And so when we start to look at that, we look at, well, what are the drivers behind that? Where are the gaps to help close that gap? And so whilst we see real strong interest from investors and growing interest from capital providers to support these business models, to support nature-based solutions, ultimately we still see a real shortfall of what we'd consider bankable or investment-ready projects. So there's some real sort of underlying drivers and sort of common themes. There's really long setup times for how long it takes to create projects. Often the development and the delivery costs are very high relative to the net revenues. And when we look at sort of community-led and much localized projects, often there's a real capacity and capability gap. So how do we marry those sort of real constraints up to unlock the wave of high quality investment ready projects that can then attract capital? And at the same time, given the various issues that we've seen across the market and concerns in the voluntary carbon market, there has been some real aversion that's building within investors. So whilst there is absolutely increasing appetite from investors, there's also a lot of cautiousness. There's some real concerns over the integrity, over what high impact really means. And as investors start to understand the real legal requirements and the challenges that means at a project level, issues around land rights, carbon regulations in different jurisdictions, these are increasingly becoming really common issues which are very thorny to unpick. And so how do we help investors understand and then help projects to meet those investor requirements over time? Next slide, please. So CAPE that has been set up to address exactly that. So CAPE intends to help projects that are looking for support to become investment ready, to access finance. And CAPE will deliver really sort of three core functions. It will support with project development. It will provide that capacity building, helping to complete PDD where required. It will also provide tailored financial transaction advisory, helping projects to ensure that they both understand the most appropriate financing structures, but also that they can access the best the best types of finance and the most appropriate finance for their projects. And thirdly, and from what we see as a really important function as well, is it will create a knowledge sharing platform. It will enable projects that are part of CAPE to be part of this community that can share common issues, share common solutions, and build a common voice for what best practice starts to look like, but also to help address universal challenges that actually may not be able to be solved at a project level, but may need to be solved more at a regulatory or jurisdictional regional level. And so as projects move their way through CAPE, by the end of the CAPE program, projects will have a really high quality, high impact business case. They'll be ready for financial close. And through this support, and the support particularly that Finance Earth will be providing, we'll support hand in hand, helping them to engage investors and really understand the transaction process to get to financial close, to get to that really important point of ultimately raising implementation finance. And so to really wrap up really where Juliet was describing this partnership, I think FSD have done an amazing job of bringing together this tripartite consortium and bringing together FSD Africa's experience of development finance, over a decade experience operating across Africa, with Africa Natural Capital Alliance and the really extensive both financial but also political reach that consortium brings, linked with our Finance Earth very practical experience of how do we make projects investment ready and how do we actually help complete that gap to help investors come into these projects and help projects understand what the most appropriate finance is for their project. So really looking forward to hearing your questions as we get into this, and thank you for sharing your time this morning. With that, I'll hand over to Fraser, who will take us through in more detail of how CAPE will act and how it will deliver support to your projects. Thank you.
Super, thanks Jamie, and yeah, nice to meet you all, everyone. My name's Fraser O'Halloran. I'm an associate here at Finance Earth. As Sarah mentioned, today I'm going to provide you with some more detail on CAPE itself, including the type of support you could expect to be provided with through the programme, some of the key eligibility criteria for prospective projects looking to enter CAPE, and a kind of more detailed timeline of what happens next. Yeah, this should help provide more clarity on CAPE itself. But as Sarah mentioned, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat, and we'll use the latter half of this webinar to kind of go through some of those in more detail. So let's start with the role of CAPE. So this slide illustrates the key steps involved in the development, implementation, and operation of a kind of typical nature-based project. I'm sure this is very familiar to many of you on the call today. So following the conceptualization of an idea, a project will seek to complete a feasibility study to understand, well, the feasibility of the potential project, taking into account technical, political, legal, social, and more considerations. If deemed feasible, the project will undergo a more detailed design process. In the case of a nature-based carbon project, this would culminate in the production of a project design document, a PDD, benefit sharing agreement, and kind of validation by an approved standards body. And then upon securing finance, where applicable, the project will then commence implementation. We recognise that the lack of support and funding available between the feasibility study and accessing implementation finance represents a key bottleneck in the development of nature-based projects across Africa. Generally, providers of implementation finance consider the risk profile of investing in the PDD development and design phase to be too high. Given this risk profile, those that do invest often require high returns for doing so, thereby generally resulting in quite significant value extraction from the project. So CAPE is specifically designed to address some of the barriers project developers face during this phase of project development journey, and will be providing both project development support, but also transaction advisory, supporting projects through this period of the development journey towards first investment close. And through doing so, the ambition is to enable a cohort of nature-based projects to secure equitable implementation finance, with the terms of this investment being more reflective of the risk profile of the project at this point in time of the development journey, and therefore kind of enabling greater value attention from the project in the long term. So the specific development and transaction services provided through CAPE will vary between the projects. We recognise that projects will be at different stages and vary different levels of support in order to get them to that point of first investment close. So what we intend to do is once projects are accepted within the first cohort of CAPE, Finance Earth and FSD Africa will work closely with these respective project developers in order to identify the specific services that are required in order to develop the projects to that point of first investment close. In this slide here, we've just kind of provided a few illustrative examples of the kinds of services which we may anticipate projects requiring through CAPE, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. So on the project development side, this may include things such as support in the development of a PDD, creating benefit sharing agreements, identifying opportunities to enhance the biodiversity and social impact of the project, and designing the associated MRV approaches to monitor and verify that impact. Or on the legal side, this could encompass things such as navigating the kind of your jurisdiction's regulatory and legal requirements for nature-based projects, or supporting in the creation of a vehicle to better facilitate investment. On the transaction advisory services side of things, we've got the development of high quality financial models in order to provide confidence to prospective investors on the financial viability of the project, creating engagement materials and facilitating meetings with potential investors, managing investor due diligence, and then modeling and structuring investment terms in collaboration between the project developer, the investor, and any other relevant stakeholders. As the implementation partner, Finance Earth will be responsible for the delivery of the transaction advisory services. For the project development services, Finance Earth will largely work with each of the respective project developers in order to identify the most appropriate service providers available to support these activities, favouring local partners where available. Grant funding will then be made available through CAPE in order to acquire these services, with the terms of the grant, i.e. returnable or non-returnable, dependent on the project types and services required, and that will be ironed out in the selection process. Finally, just on the support available, just so we're all fully clear on CAPE, CAPE will not be providing funding for implementation finance, but has been designed to instead provide that support for investment readiness with implementation finance then provided by the third-party investor. So to bring kind of what Jamie discussed and what I've just been through the past couple of slides together, we thought it would be advantageous to provide a hypothetical example of a journey a project may go on through CAPE. Here we're using an example of a 5,000 hectare mangrove project. So at the start, we're picking up the project at the point that it's applying to CAPE. So at this point, the project has completed a feasibility study and identified a viable opportunity to generate carbon credits through the restoration of mangrove ecosystems. It's commenced the EFIC process with local communities and indigenous peoples, and has initiated the process to securing the land rights to the ecosystem services, i.e. the carbon credits generated by the projects, and has developed an initial plan for how the project could enhance the biodiversity and social outcomes delivered by the project beyond the existing carbon co-benefit standard. So, for example, the Vera CCB standard. Upon being selected to be part of the CAPE cohort, Finance Earth and FSD Africa would work with the project developer to understand and map out the services required in order to develop it to that point of first investment close. In this case, on the project development side, this will involve kind of supporting the development of PDD and the benefit sharing, understanding ways in order to measure and monitor the biodiversity impact, and yeah, providing various forms of legal support. As mentioned previously, these services would be funded by CAPE through grants, with the terms to be decided on the project-by-project basis. On the transaction and advisory services, Finance Earth would support the development of the robust financial model, provide support in engaging with potential buyers of the carbon credits and investors who may have an interest in providing that implementation finance. And then following the kind of identification of those carbon buyers and investors, Finance Earth would work closely with these stakeholders, project developers, and any other relevant stakeholders to kind of structure the key terms and ultimately execute the investment. So at the point of graduating from CAPE, the project will have secured kind of equitable investment from potentially an impact investor and will be ready to commence project implementation. So onto eligibility. We have 3 key eligibility criteria for projects looking to kind of be within the first cohort of CAPE. And that is 1, that they must be nature-based and located within Africa. The project must have completed a feasibility study. And 3, the project must have identified viable revenue opportunities linked to the project. Alongside these key eligibility criteria, we are particularly interested in projects which can demonstrate a range of things listed here, and they include a clear pathway to financial viability, potentially having already engaged with potential buyers of the ecosystem services which are generated by the project, demonstrated a consideration of the biodiversity and social impact of the project beyond those existing carbon standards, as I mentioned, the use of robust standards and methodologies for the validation and verification of these outcomes, demonstrates an ability to be scaled within the region or replicated elsewhere, either by the project developer or by a third party, and that there is a positive kind of political, regulatory, and legal enabling environment within the jurisdiction that the project is located within. So all projects submitting EOIs will be initially screened against these eligibility criteria and then this initial assessment criteria in order to understand their suitability for CAPE. So as you will have heard, we were very excited last week to have opened the expressions of interest. And so those have now opened. The form is relatively straightforward. It's been designed that way, with the majority of questions kind of requiring single word or drop down responses. and is estimated to take about 20 to 30 minutes to complete. This EOI window will close on the 27th, Wednesday, the 27th of November, at 5 p.m. East Africa time, so 2 weeks today. So we encourage all interested parties to submit an EOI at your earliest convenience. The project team will be assessing EOI submissions against those initial screening criteria on an ongoing basis. Where a project passes those criteria, they will be invited to provide more details on their project. This additional information request will be shared with successful participants, and it will be similar to the EOI in that it will be in a Google form, and we'll just request responses then. Project developers will then have until Wednesday, the 15th of January 2025 to provide this additional information. The project team will then assess these projects based on the additional information and devise a long list of suitable projects. Those kind of project developers who are included within that long list will be invited to interviews with a short list of up to 5 projects who will form the first cohort of CAPE to be finalized in February of 2025. As discussed earlier, we will then work with these shortlisted projects to identify the services which will be required, who will deliver these services and when, and map that out over time. And it's expected that the delivery of these services will commence in April 2025 and run through until March 2026 in order to support these projects towards that first investment close. So yeah, to conclude this section of the webinar, we encourage all of you who are developing projects that may benefit from the services provided by CAPE to submit an expression of interest before the 27th of November. If you yourselves do not have a suitable project but are aware of other developers who may have an interest in CAPE, we would kindly ask that you share this opportunity with them. To access the expression of interest, you can scan this QR code, you can visit FSD Africa's website, and we'll also be sharing a link with the recording of this webinar and any other useful information following the webinar. Finally, if following this webinar you still have any additional questions regarding CAPE, you can get in touch with us at the email address listed here, so cape@fsdafrica.org. And with that, yeah, I'll pass back over to Sarah, who will lead us through the Q&A section of the webinar.
Great, thanks so much, Juliet, Jamie and Fraser. There's lots of information in there. Hopefully it's covered a lot of initial questions. I can see some great questions coming in through the Q&A section, so please do keep posting those. The team are working hard to answer them as we go along. But there's a couple of questions. There's questions in different categories. We've got some that we've seen come up also before this webinar around that project development journey and at what stage would CAPE be, would projects be eligible into the CAPE cohort. So sort of 2 parts to this question. I'll probably send the first part to Jamie and second part to Reshma. The first is, if a project hasn't got a completed feasibility study, or they have a feasibility study but maybe it needs updating, it was done a little while ago, is it eligible for CAPE? And if people have questions around that, what are the next steps?
Yeah, so if there's been a feasibility study completed, or indeed even if it was historically sort of maybe a few years out of date, please do submit. We're still very keen to see. We recognise that often projects, sometimes the feasibility process can actually be very extensive. So we recognise that there may be projects that that are able to sort of benefit from the support and then go through an accelerated PDD process. So please do apply even with those feasibilities.
Great, thanks, Jamie. And the second part is, if a project has a feasibility study, but for whatever reason it might take longer than 12 months to get to a point where it's ready for investment, and to complete the project design document, would that type of project still be eligible? And Reshma, I wonder if you had any thoughts on this.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Reshma Shah, Carbon Markets Lead at FSD Africa, and also the lead for CAPE. Sarah, sorry, my line cracked up a bit. If you could just please repeat the question for me.
Yes, of course. So if a project has already completed their feasibility study, but for whatever reason, it will take longer than 12 months to get their project design document ready and get them ready for investment, would they still be eligible for CAPE?
Thanks for repeating that, Sarah. So I think as we went through the slides, we went through the two-step process. I think it's going to be quite important for us to understand exactly where it is within the PBD and what support we can provide. So what we would advise those projects is to apply to CAPE and to provide as much details as possible on what work has been done and what is outstanding, and that will be part of the evaluation process as well.
Great, thank you so much. There's also another group of questions around the funding and types of support within that. There's a question on what we define as a repayable grant. So as Fraser went through, he talked about the sort of structure of grant funding for some of the project development services and repayable grant funding for others. That would be worked out with projects in a kind of bespoke work plan to identify which services are most useful for what types of funding. Jamie, is there anything you'd like to add here on how we might approach repayable grants specifically?
So very really importantly, there are no sort of hard and fast rules. So we're able to be very tailored and flexible at this stage. This is something that we'll work through with the projects that are ultimately selected to go through the program, and so that's going to be a really key part of this that we're not wanting to dictate. We have got some internal initial views as to what elements should be more of a repayable grant element, and mostly that relates to the actual PDD specifically. Where there might be PDD funding required, but ultimately, I think the key message here is that it's not sort of written in stone, and it's very much wanting to be co-designed with projects that are part of this CAPE program.
And I think also linked to that, there's a question around sort of what do projects have to do themselves? So is the support provided by CAPE, is it free to the projects? Are there any commitments that the projects might have to put in themselves in terms of time engaging with the CAPE process?
So we are looking for the organisations that are able to commit sufficient internal resources and time to be able to be successfully put through the program. But ultimately, the CAPE program is looking to support and provide that wrap of services and where required funding to help get to that point of investment readiness. So so there is again flexibility around that, but we clearly are going to be looking for organisations that are able to put in resource to be able to get to that, to take themselves through that process.
Great. And just within the same category, there's a question around as we get towards the sort of the end of the CAPE support process. There was a clarification that sort of CAPE will be providing the project development support and the financial transaction advisory support, but not the project implementation funding
Correct.
itself through CAPE. But what kind of services could CAPE provide in connecting to potential investors and making sure that projects don't go through the accelerator and then the accelerator ends and the project's sort of out on their own? How is CAPE structured to support them beyond?
It's a really good question, and for us, success looks like where the projects ultimately secure implementation finance, and so CAPE very much will be working with projects to go through that journey to ensure that they do secure third-party finance, and part of that is to make sure that they're understanding what are their options. So the different types of financing that's available in the market, and that's evolving at the moment. And indeed, Finance Earth will be sharing a lot of the insights we've had about leading on alternative ways of project finance for these types of implementation stages, with a view that we want to maximise the value retention by the community. So our sort of another really key objective of this is ensuring that these projects retain as much value, and that doesn't just get leaked out to the sort of carbon finance element.
Sarah,
Great.
can I perhaps add something there?
Of course.
Because I think just to underscore that's one of the reasons that we're partnering with Finance Earth together with ourselves. I think combined we've got a lot of networks and experience with investors that are interested in this space. So it's not just the intention is to try and test how we can get these projects to financial close and investment, but really pulling in the interest and building the awareness amongst the investment community that we all have access to. And I think a component of CAPE that will help with that is also, a sort of learning and development component where we are going to be sort of sharing some of the experiences as we go along this process with the investment community specifically amongst other audiences. So that they can understand, how are these services being applied, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities for them as investors in then coming in and really sort of off taking some of the projects that are going to go through.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Maybe also, just as we're with you, Juliet, this might be one for FSD Africa. There's a question around what do we mean by an enabling jurisdiction? So we've got a broad scope with CAPE. Any project within Africa is eligible to apply. Within the expression of interest, we will be looking at what are the enabling conditions for the project that mean it's likely to be successful, specifically within the kind of policy context. Are there any considerations projects should have?
And other colleagues do weigh in here, but I think we just we recognise that countries are at different stages of the journey when it comes to the regulatory and policy frameworks that they've embarked on or that they're thinking about embarking on. And so we don't want to sort of only be focused on projects where there is already cast in stone and a strong enabling regulation or policy in that regard. But I think it's we will be looking at where that jurisdiction is at in terms of both its willingness to strengthen its carbon markets and enable that market to work, irrespective of whether it's made a significant amount of progress on that journey. So I think we want to sort of keep quite an open mind there. But other colleagues, if you've got anything to add, then please do.
I guess I can add to that as well, and it just depends on whether the project is in the voluntary markets, compliance market, and how things have actually progressed in those different markets. But also more importantly is aside from CAPE, we're also doing a lot of engagements around carbon policy and governance, and we can also use those engagements in terms of evaluating the enabling jurisdiction and progress. And so, as Juliet said, I think the key thing here is it's not to eliminate, but just to ensure the success as well to investment close within that period.
Great, thanks so much. There has also been a few questions around what do we mean by nature-based projects. I think we've gone into a few examples within the slides, and I can see the team answering questions here. And also around the scope of projects and the scale. I wonder whether maybe Fraser, you'd like to sort of talk about the types of nature-based projects. And I don't know if Jonathan, you would like to sort of weigh in. I can see you answered that question on the chat after Fraser.
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we remain open in terms of the types of nature-based projects which we're accepting. Obviously, the title of the program is the Carbon Accelerator program for the environment, but we're not necessarily limited to nature-based carbon projects. There may be an opportunity if a project can kind of viably demonstrate that there is a potential to deliver revenues from other means, for example, biodiversity credits. Then we would welcome the opportunity to work with those projects too. But in terms of the projects, some of which were listed on the slide, includes ARR projects, REDD+, wider blue carbon work, but also we could look at agroforestry, potentially soil carbon, other types of projects. We remain open, and all projects will be kind of assessed and considered within the ERI process. So if you are at all hesitant, we would recommend you still apply for the EOI, and they will be considered in the screening process.
Thanks, Fraser. Jonathan, is there anything you wanted to add? Don't worry if not.
Nothing to add.
Great.
Fraser was very comprehensive.
Great. We've got another question around the funding support. There's a few parts of this question. We want projects to be designed that they're benefit sharing for communities and provide sufficient support for local livelihoods and agriculture that lead to the permanence of the high quality credits. But this can lower the return on investment for corporate investors. So what type of investors might we be looking for towards the sort of later stages for CAPE support when we're engaging with investors? Are we looking to bring in corporate investors? Are we looking at blended finance models? I'm going to pass that one over to you again, Jamie.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, it's a good question, and we're for this round of CAPE, we're wanting to have quite a broad range of projects, both in the types of the underlying income models, but also the scale. And so what that means is that actually we are not being overly prescriptive over the specific investors. And so we expect there will be blended finance opportunities in many of these. There will be some potentially, if there are large scale ones that may be more suitable for pure sort of corporate or institutional investment, but we have to recognize that the scale of those is often very different to some of the potentially higher impact but smaller scale projects, and so yeah, very not wanting to prescribe at that stage, and indeed, given the sort of collective networks and experience between FSD Africa and Finance Earth, we have a really significant amount of experience and network that we can bring from the investor base, depending on what type of funding and capital is needed. And so part of what CAPE will be doing is really helping projects to understand what is the most appropriate type of capital and who are the right investors for that capital, and making those connections through this process.
Thanks, Jamie. I think that is a great question. I just wondered whether Juliet or Kelvin would like to add anything to that. Just as an opportunity, but no worries if Jamie's covered it.
Yeah, I think all covered.
Great.
Yep.
Then a question that I'm gonna put to Fraser, just on the kind of the ideal profiles of applicants for the expression of interest. There's a question around whether we can sort of outline what an ideal applicant might look like from the project developer's perspective. So are we looking to support local project developers, non-profits, for-profits? Are we expecting a range? Do we have a sort of preference on eligibility within those categories?
I think, as mentioned before, like I think there's a preference for supporting local developers where possible, but within everything else, we remain quite agnostic and will assess based on the opportunities available. And I think one of the key areas which is important for CAPE is the opportunity to scale and share learnings and ensure they're applicable to the kind of wider market. And so that would be taken into consideration when we come to assess the projects through the expression of interest. But yeah, there's definitely a key focus of CAPE in order to kind of build local capacity across the countries in which the projects are being developed in. But that is by no means limiting wider project developers to apply for the expression of interest.
And linked to this, a sort of follow-on question. So would we expect it to be the project developer themselves that applies, or could it be a partner organisation that's helping projects, a range of projects across Africa? And what if there's multiple projects being worked on by a single project developer?
Good question. So I think, yeah, I think anyone can apply as long as they've kind of got the buy-in from all parties involved in the project to kind of submit the expression of interest. And if there's a developer who has multiple projects which may be suitable for CAPE, then we'd welcome them to apply multiple times to the expression of interest, and we'll consider the projects on an ongoing basis there. in the long list of kind of finalized projects suitable for Cape, it may be that we choose to only provide support to one if there are multiple other opportunities which are available. But there's definitely no restrictions on the number of times you can respond to the expression of interest.
Great. And we've got a couple of questions that have come in on scale of projects and whether there's a sort of minimum size. Caleb, you have answered this question in the chat. I wondered whether you wanted to share a bit more of about that answer, as it's come in a couple of times.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah. So hi everyone. I'm Caleb. I'm an associate director at Finance Earth. So I think we don't have any kind of minimum scale requirements currently with Cape. What I would say for from a scale perspective is that depending on what your implementation methodology is, how you're generating your revenues, there's likely to be a minimum viable economic scale. So projects will need to be able to kind of prove or show that they are kind of on a pathway to becoming economically sustainable. But I think from an individual project perspective, I don't think we have a minimum size. I would say do apply and include that information around economics and size in your application.
Great, thank you. And then also for the projects, what's the sort of expectation on them in terms of, so this is a carbon accelerator. We would expect projects to be focused on nature-based carbon removals or avoidance. A clarification question within this space is, are we just looking at restoration or reforestation projects? I think we're broad in the scope, so beyond just forestry projects into sort of other land uses as well, potentially blue carbon. And what would the expectations be on projects within this? So we are focused on not just benefits for climate, but also biodiversity and communities. And the question's really around, should we expect projects to have specific targets or be tracking sort of data needs within those co-benefits? So on the biodiversity side, but also maybe the job creation, income generation, benefit sharing with the community. We've just heard from Fraser, so I wonder whether Reshma, would you like to answer this one?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. So when we first thing we're looking at is kind of high integrity credits. So we will be looking at all those aspects around the biodiversity, but also community access, livelihood, and all the other core benefits that come with the project will be part of the consideration as well.
And also, just a question that's come in just now that would be great for you, Reshma, is are there language requirements? So we've posted the EOI in English, but many African countries speak French. And do we sort of foresee any challenges in the service provided through language barriers?
I think that's a great question, and actually a great point that the EOI is in English. But because we do want Cape to cover the whole continent, I don't see language being a barrier. We will, if it's a project that meets all the criteria for Cape, we will manage through the language barrier issue. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to stay with you just for another minute, Reshma. Just on, so one of the questions is, what if a project doesn't meet the deadline for the EOI? I think from our point of view, we have the deadline. If anybody has a particular struggle and they just sort of need a few more days or something and can't get it in, please do send an email beforehand to the Cape email address to let us know, and we can talk it through with you. But beyond this cycle of Cape, if a project isn't eligible this time, but thinks that they might have a great project to discuss with the Cape Partnership in future, or for whatever reason missed this particular cohort, what could that look like for them?
So obviously we're trying to keep to the timelines for Cape in particular, because we do want to get to that, financial close in that timeline that we outline. But I'd say, CAPE is one project. It's not the only project that we will be looking at as FSD. We have quite an extensive nature program. Carbon's a big part of what we're looking at as a strategy as well as the investment side. So I would say if it's something that they have missed the deadline, is to still write in but we can't guarantee anything, but we definitely want to be able to engage and see what we could do in the future as well. This is the first phase of CAPE. One of the key outcomes from CAPE is the what next, as we're looking at it as well. And of course, we can't determine what that is until we go through the accelerator. But we're hoping that this isn't a one-off and there'll be a lot more learnings from it and a lot more targeted designed projects support as well following that.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to highlight, that obviously for this webinar, we've been focused on the launch and the expression of interest and making sure projects who are eligible are aware of CAPE and could have all of the answers that they need to apply. But you will be hearing more about the CAPE throughout its lifetime. We're very much focused on the learnings that are coming out of CAPE being accessible for everybody beyond just the cohort within this current cycle. So we're very much designing it so that there are benefits for other projects that they can learn from what the CAPE has done. Fraser, is there something you would like to add?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I just wanted to chip into what Reshma was saying. Even if I would say, even if you consider your project to be at a slightly early stage for CAPE, we would still encourage you to submit an expression of interest so that we have the information of your project on hand, and it won't take very long. The initial expression of interest will take about 20 minutes. And so where there are potentially future phases of CAPE or other opportunities to engage with FSD, then the key information will be in that central repository, and we can look to kind of connect beyond that. So even if you think you may be too early, we would still encourage you to apply.
Great, thanks so much. Fraser, while you're still here, there's a question around the project development advisors and transaction advisors. So Finance Earth will be providing transaction advice and a whole sort of set of services that we'll tailor as we get to know the cohort of projects better, to make sure that our services meet their needs and help them sort of be more likely to secure investment at the end of the CAPE. But in terms of the project development advisors and the services within that, would you expect projects to have already identified the right kind of service providers for activities that maybe are outside of their skill set, or will the CAPE help them to identify service providers that would be beneficial for them?
Yeah, no, not at all. I think at the start of CAPE, we would work with the project developers in order to understand, what services are required and who could deliver those services, and favouring local partners where possible. So Finance Earth and FSD Africa and Anchor have a range of a large network, and we would be able to connect with various partners through that. But we would also welcome thoughts from the project developer on any service providers they are aware of who we could look to connect with and engage with through this project. So if they have connections, great, but it's not necessarily a requirement, and we would look to work with projects in the early phases of CAPE to identify those service providers.
Thanks so much for answering that. Jamie, I have a couple of questions for you now. So we've gone through the kind of funding and support that CAPE would provide. What if an organisation wants to sort of co-finance maybe the project or partner with CAPE in another capacity? How should they engage with CAPE in that respect? And then the second one is, if projects are sort of further along in that project development journey, so they're already registered and validated, but they're pre-issuance, can they apply for a second issuance scaling opportunity?
So I'll take those in reverse order. So yeah, thank you for those questions. So in terms of where a project may be operational, they've already achieved verification and an initial sale. Really, the additionality of Cape, we need to be clear of what is that expansion opportunity. And so we wouldn't want to rule that out, but I would sort of emphasize that we are wanting to ensure that there's a very clear additionality that can be supported through Cape's work. And so we need to be very clear on what the expansion opportunity is and what that sort of business case is. And but that being said, we have seen ourselves existing small projects which are now looking to expand quite significantly over time. So that and those we would see as eligible, but where it really comes back to that point of being clear on what the additionality is. In terms of additional partners that might be wanting to co-finance or co-fund or collaborate more with Cape, please do engage. You can absolutely still engage. We're wanting to mobilize more of an ecosystem around this. We are in this first phase of Cape, so we are still clearly looking at this initial cohort. But if there are interested partners that are wanting to look at how they can either co-support their specific projects, and clearly that can be complementary to Cape, absolutely we're open to exploring what that could look like, and again really encourage you to engage with the process and engage with ourselves to explore what that could look like into the future.
Thanks so much, Jamie. It's a couple of minutes to go, so I'm about to wrap up. But just in case we've missed anything, anyone else from the sort of partnership team on the call that wants to sort of say anything before we close? Hopefully we've covered it. We've got lots of answers and questions in the chat that the team have been working on as we've been going through. If we've missed anything, we will be sharing sort of summaries of frequently asked questions with the team. Reshma, I can see.
Yeah, Sarah, I was just going to say that we're going to post this soon, but we should get the microsite on a Cape site specifically set up within the next day or two, and all the material, including the recording of this webinar, but a Q&A would also be there. So in case anybody has, the links are all there as well for the EOI. So that will be a great depository for any questions and any new developments with relating to Cape as well.
Absolutely, that's a good point to flag. So we'll be following up with all of you, including a link to that dedicated website for Cape, and we will share a recording of this webinar along with the slides and a link to the expression of interest and some of the frequently asked questions that have been coming up. So with that, it's been a pleasure to have all of you with us today. Thank you so much for joining, and hopefully you feel excited about Cape as we do. In the meantime, we look forward to receiving your expressions of interest or emails, and yeah, please do get in touch at that email address, which we will also share with participants afterwards if anyone has missed it. And just keep watching this space. There will be learnings coming out from Cape that we'll be sharing, and they'll be on social media as